Some houses feel alive even when they are silent. The Raza house in Lahore was like that, old brick walls that held decades of whispered arguments, laughter soaked into the wooden floors, the smell of cardamom chai permanently embedded in the curtains. At night, when everyone was asleep and the ceiling fan clicked its slow rhythm above you, the house felt like it was breathing. Zayn Raza was 23 years old, and he had spent most of those years learning how to disappear inside that breathing house. He was the older brother, the responsible one, the one who had graduated top of his class, secured a job at an architecture firm in the city, and smiled at the right moments during family dinners. He ironed his own shirts. He called his mother every Sunday. He was, by every measure his family used, a good son. What his family did not know, what no one knew, was that Zayn spent most nights staring at the ceiling, feeling like a man made of glass who had learned to walk without shattering. Every morning was a performance. Every smile was rehearsed. Every "I'm fine" was a small, quiet lie he told so effortlessly that he had almost started to believe it himself. He was 23 years old, and he had never once in his life told the truth about who he was. His younger brother, Daniel, was 19. Where Zayn was careful, Daniel was careless, in the best possible way. He laughed too loudly. He left his sketchbooks open on the kitchen table, pages filled with drawings of the street outside their window, of the pigeons on the rooftop, of faces he studied on the bus. He argued with their father about politics and somehow made the old man smile while doing it. He wore his heart like a badge pinned to the outside of his shirt. They had shared a childhood the way all siblings do, a mixture of affection and rivalry, borrowed sweaters and stolen cookies, long car rides where they sat on opposite sides of the back seat and pretended not to find each other funny. They had grown up side by side without ever fully knowing each other. And then, everything changed the summer Daniel came home from university. It was the end of June, the kind of heat that sat on your chest like a warm stone, and Daniel arrived home with two large duffel bags, a sunburn across his nose, and something different in his eyes that Zayn could not immediately name. He seemed quieter. Not sad, Daniel was never sad in ways that showed, but quieter in a particular way, like someone who had a secret they were carrying gently, the way you carry a cup filled to the very brim. Their mother noticed nothing. She was too busy being overjoyed at having both her sons under the same roof, feeding them 3 meals a day and arguing cheerfully about whether Daniel had lost weight. Their father clapped Daniel on the back, asked about his grades, and returned to his newspaper. But Zayn noticed. He noticed the way Daniel sometimes grew still at dinner, fork suspended midway to his mouth, as if he had drifted somewhere very far away. He noticed the way Daniel watched him, not always, not constantly, but in moments when he thought Zayn wasn't looking, with an expression Zayn couldn't read. He told himself he was imagining it. They fell into a routine over those first weeks. Mornings were their mother's territory, chai, breakfast, conversation. Afternoons Daniel spent drawing or reading in the small back courtyard where the jasmine grew wild along the wall. Evenings, their father watched the news on television, and the whole family gathered in a loose, comfortable orbit around the living room. And nights were when the house went quiet, and both brothers retreated to their separate rooms, separated by a single wall and the width of a hallway. Zayn would lie awake, listening to the city outside his window. He had always been a poor sleeper. His thoughts at night were the honest versions of himself that he could not afford to be during the day, restless, aching, full of a longing he had no proper name for. Not for a person exactly, for a life, for the version of himself he only permitted to exist in the dark. He was 23 years old, and he was deeply, quietly, terribly lonely. He did not know, could not have known, that his little brother was lying awake on the other side of that wall, carrying something just as heavy. It happened on a Friday evening in July. Their parents had gone to Islamabad for a wedding, a cousin's ceremony that would keep them away for 4 days. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the feeling in the house once they left. A loosening, the way a room feels when you open a window after a long winter. Zayn ordered food from outside. They ate on the rooftop, spreading a sheet between them, watching the city lights below while the heat finally, mercifully, began to soften into evening. Daniel was in a good mood, the kind of mood he carried easily, that moved around him like weather. They talked about small things at first. His courses, a professor Daniel found insufferable, a film they had both watched separately and discussed now with the enthusiasm of people rediscovering an opinion they had forgotten they shared. Then Daniel said, without transition or warning, "Bye, can I ask you something?" Zayn looked at him. "You're going to ask regardless, so yes." Daniel smiled, but it was a smaller smile than usual. He was picking at the edge of the sheet beneath them. "Do you ever feel like there's a version of yourself you can't show anyone? Like you're carrying something and the weight of it isn't the hard part, the hiding it is?" The city hummed below them. A motorbike honked in the distance. Somewhere down the street, a vendor was calling out prices in a sing-song voice. Zayn did not answer immediately. It was such a specific question, so precisely aimed at the exact center of everything. He never spoke about that. For a moment he genuinely wondered if Daniel somehow already knew. But that was impossible. He had been so careful, a lifetime of careful. "Everyone feels that way sometimes," Zayn said finally. It was a deflection and he knew it, and from the brief flicker in Daniel's eyes, his brother knew it too. "Right," said Daniel. "Yeah." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Charged, like the air before rain. Daniel did not push. That was one of the quiet gifts about him. He knew when not to push. He simply leaned back on his hands, tilted his face up toward the sky, and let the subject drift away like smoke. But Zayn replayed that question for the rest of the night. He lay in his room, the ceiling fan clicking above him, and he turned Daniel's words over and over like a stone in his hand, examining every surface. "Do you ever feel like there's a version of yourself you can't show anyone?" Yes, God, yes, every single day of his life. What he didn't know, what kept him staring at the ceiling until 2 a.m., was whether Daniel had been asking about himself. The next day, Zayn left early for work. He spent 10 hours at the firm, bent over blueprints and structural calculations, having 3 cups of bad coffee and 1 productive meeting and several unproductive ones. He rode the bus home with his forehead against the window, watching the city blur past. He ate dinner, helped clear the dishes, and went to his room. This was his life. It was a good life, technically. Comfortable, structured, productive. And yet, sitting at his desk that night with his laptop open and the architecture software glowing back at him, he felt the familiar hollowness settle into his chest, that particular ache of a life that fits on the outside but pinches somewhere you can't quite reach. He had known since he was 16. 16, the year he sat in the back row of a biology class and felt his face grow hot looking at the boy beside him, not with embarrassment but with something far more confusing, far more profound. He had spent weeks afterward convincing himself it was nothing. Boys went through phases. It was a confusion. It would pass. It did not pass. Instead, it grew quieter and more contained, the way a fire that has nowhere to spread turns inward and learns to burn on less air. He was 17, then 18, then 20, then 23, and the truth of himself sat in the center of his chest like a stone he had swallowed and never managed to dissolve. He had never dated anyone. His family occasionally asked, his mother mostly in the gentle, roundabout way mothers ask questions they already know the answer to. He deflected expertly. Work was busy. He wasn't ready. These things took time. He had one friend, Sami, who knew. They had been friends since school, and Sami had figured it out long before Zayn admitted it, had simply sat down across from him one afternoon in their final year of university and said, "I know, and it doesn't change anything." And that had been that. Sami was the only person in the world Zayn had ever allowed to see the glass inside him. Now Zayn closed his laptop and sat in the dark. Down the hall, he could hear the faint sound of music from Daniel's room, something soft, something melancholy, a song he didn't recognize. He sat listening to it for a long moment, and then, before he could think too clearly about whether it was a good idea, he got up and walked down the hall and knocked on his brother's door. "Come in," said Daniel. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, sketchbook open in his lap, pencil in hand. His desk lamp was on. The rest of the room was dim. There was a quiet quality to him. Zayn thought, something composed and interior that he hadn't fully noticed before, perhaps because he had spent 23 years looking past his little brother rather than at him. "What are you drawing?" Zayn asked. Daniel turned the sketchbook. On the page was a face, not finished, just suggested in a few careful lines. A young man with a direct gaze and a guarded expression. "Who is that?" Zayn asked. Daniel hesitated for just a half-second. "Someone from uni," he said. "A friend." Zayn nodded. He leaned against the doorframe. "Can I sit?" Daniel's eyebrows went up, just slightly. This was not something Zayn usually did, appearing at his door at night to sit on his floor, but he gestured to the small chair by the window. "Of course." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Daniel kept drawing small, precise marks that slowly accumulated into something fuller, more real. Zayn watched, struck suddenly by how good Daniel actually was, the economy of his lines, the patience of his observation. "You're talented," Zayn said. Daniel looked up. "You've seen my drawings 1,000 times." "I know, but I don't think I've really looked before." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Not quite a smile, something softer and more uncertain than a smile. "Is everything okay, bye?" he said. "Yes," said Zayn. Then, surprising himself, he added, "I just realized I don't really know you very well, and you're my brother. That seemed worth doing something about." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with an expression that Zayn could only describe as careful hope. "I'd like that," said Daniel. "I'd really like that." And so began, quite quietly, the most important summer of Zayn's life. It started simply, a knocked door, a borrowed chair, a conversation about drawings and music and the strange sensation of being home after months away. But it became something else. Night after night, Zayn found himself making the walk down the hall to his brother's room. Sometimes they talked until midnight. Sometimes they said very little and simply existed in the same space, which was its own kind of language. He learned things about his brother he had never known. He learned that Daniel was afraid of birds, not phobic exactly, but deeply unsettled by them since a childhood incident involving a rooftop and an aggressive crow that Zayn had been too young to remember. He learned that Daniel had been drawing seriously since he was 12, that he had filled 17 sketchbooks, that he had once been so absorbed in a sketch that he missed an entire flight and didn't notice until the gate was already closed. He learned that Daniel could not sleep without some kind of ambient sound, music, rain, traffic, and that the silence of exam nights at the university hostel had been a particular form of torture. He learned, slowly and with a growing tightening in his chest, that his brother was not as effortlessly happy as he seemed. There was a weight Daniel carried. Zayn could see it more clearly now that he was actually looking, in the pauses between sentences, in the way his pen grew still sometimes while he was drawing, in the particular quality of certain silences. It was not unhappiness exactly. It was more like containment, like a person who had built walls so artfully that they had come to look like architecture rather than armor. One night, it was the second week, a Tuesday, the city outside wrapped in the haze of late July. Daniel put his sketchbook down and looked at Zayn with an expression that was entirely new, direct, decided, as if he had made a choice. "Bye," he said. "I want to tell you something." Zayn looked up from the book he was reading, or pretending to read. "Okay. And I need you to not say anything until I'm done." "Okay," Zayn said again, more carefully now. Daniel looked down at his hands. They were still, which was unusual for him. His hands were normally always moving, sketching invisible lines in the air when he talked. This stillness felt significant. "There was someone," he said, "at university, a person I cared about very much. Someone I thought cared about me too." He paused. "His name was Camille." The room was very quiet. "We were close for almost a year," Daniel continued. His voice was even controlled, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed the feeling out of a sentence and are left with only the words. "We used to study together every night. We used to walk along the canal on weekends. He used to call me just to talk about nothing in particular." He stopped. "And then in February he told me that what we were doing was wrong, that he was confused, that he was going to get engaged to a girl his family had found for him, that we should stop seeing each other entirely." He looked up then. "And the worst part," Daniel said, his voice finally slightly losing its evenness, just the faintest tremor, barely audible, "the worst part was that I understood him. I understood exactly why he did it. And that was almost harder than if I had been angry." The ceiling fan turned above them. The music from Daniel's phone drifted softly between them. Zayn did not say anything. He had promised he wouldn't. But inside his chest, something enormous and wordless was happening, a loosening, a cracking open, the sensation of a door swinging wide in a room he had kept bolted for years. Because here was his little brother, 19 years old, sitting cross-legged on his bed, having just told him the truest thing a person can tell another person. And Zayn's first feeling was not shock. It was recognition. When Daniel finished, the silence lasted for a long time. Zayn was looking at his brother, really looking, with the full weight of his attention, and Daniel was looking back, and between them the air felt different, thinner, more real, the way air feels after lightning when the storm is still arriving. "Okay," said Zayn, because he had promised to wait. "You can say something now," Daniel said. His voice was careful, guarded. He was bracing, Zayn realized, bracing for whatever came next. The jaw set, the shoulders slightly raised. Zayn thought about what to say. He had perhaps 30 seconds in which the right choice would determine everything about what happened next. He could offer sympathy and say nothing true. He could be kind in the ordinary way, careful, external, safe. He could nod and change the subject and Daniel would understand, and they would go on as before, slightly closer but still essentially separate. He looked at his brother's guarded face and he thought, "I have been performing for 23 years, and I am so tired, and here is the one person who has just handed me a key, and I do not know if I can pick it up." "Daniel," he said. "Yeah. You asked me something on the rooftop a few weeks ago." He paused. "About carrying a version of yourself that you can't show anyone." Daniel went very still. "I deflected," Zayn said. "I'm sorry. It was a coward's answer to an honest question." The silence between them shifted again. "Bye." "I'm not done," Zayn said. And then he said the words he had never said aloud to anyone in his family, the words that he had only ever said once, to Sami in a coffee shop in their 3rd year of university, and even then in a voice barely above a whisper. "I understand what you went through, more than you know, more than I've ever allowed anyone in this house to know." He watched the understanding arrive in Daniel's expression. Not surprise, not quite, more like confirmation. The way you feel when you suspected something and reality agrees with you. "How long?" Daniel asked. "Since I was 16. "And you've never?" "No, never, not with anyone." He paused. "Sami knows, that's it." Daniel exhaled slowly. And then, to Zayn's complete astonishment, his brother's eyes filled with tears, not crying, not quite, but the kind of eyes that have been holding water for a long time and have finally been given permission to admit it. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "I'm so sorry you've been carrying that alone for so long." Zayn opened his mouth to say something deflecting, something like "it's fine" or "I manage," but the words didn't come, because he was looking at his little brother's face, open and real and full of a genuine grief on his behalf, and he found that for once in his life he could not locate the performance. He could not find the mask. It had simply, quietly, slipped away. "I'm sorry too," he said, "about Camille." Daniel nodded. "It still hurts." "I know," he paused. "I mean, I don't know exactly, but I understand the shape of it." "Yeah," Daniel said, "I think you do." They sat in the lamplit room for a long time after that, not saying very much, not needing to. There was something enormous between them now, a new thing, fragile and real, that had not existed before this night, and both of them seemed to understand instinctively that it needed to be treated gently, held carefully, not spoken to death. When Zayn finally stood to leave, Daniel said, "Bye." "Yeah. Thank you for not pretending." Zayn stood in the doorway for a moment. The hallway was dark behind him. His own room was dark. The house was asleep. "Thank you for making it possible," he said. Something loosened between them after that night. Not everything. They were still in the daytime, the ordinary version of brothers, passing each other in the kitchen, arguing over the television remote, their mother watching them both with the satisfied expression of someone who had always believed they would be closer if they just tried. On the surface, nothing had changed. But the nights were different now. The conversations went deeper. They talked about things they had never spoken about to anyone. Zayn told Daniel about the years of pretending, the exhaustion of it, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who loved you, and knowing that the version they loved was only partially true. Daniel told Zayn about Camille with more honesty now, the whole of it, the joy and the pain, and the complicated aftermath of caring for someone who ultimately chose fear over love. They talked about their parents, about the specific impossibility of having this conversation with their mother and father, not because their parents were cruel, because they were not, but because there was a category of understanding that existed so far outside their parents' experience that it would require a kind of translation neither brother knew how to perform. They held their parents' love carefully, knowing it was real, knowing it had limits they had nothing to do with but would nonetheless always feel. "Do you think we're wrong?" Daniel asked one evening. It was almost casual, the question had no apparent build-up, but Zayn knew from the way Daniel's pen stopped moving that it had been sitting there for a while. "No," Zayn said immediately. Then, because Daniel deserved more than a one-word answer, "I spent years asking myself that, really deeply, and every time I tried to believe I was wrong or broken or confused, something in me pushed back. Something said, 'This is not confusion, this is just you.'" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I think I believe that, I just sometimes need to hear it." "I know," Zayn said, "me too." There were evenings when they didn't talk at all, when Daniel drew and Zayn read, and the room held them both in a comfortable quiet that neither of them had known before with another person. There was something specific about being known and still being chosen for company. Zayn had spent so long performing that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be somewhere with someone and have that be enough. He found himself, to his mild astonishment, feeling something approaching peace. Not a complete peace. There was still the stone in his chest, the truth of himself that lived only in the dark. There was still the future, which was large and complicated and full of questions he had no answers for. There was still the world, which had its own opinions about who he was allowed to be. But in this house, in this room with his brother, for the first time in his adult life, Zayn Raza felt like a man who did not have to disappear. It was the 22nd of August. Zayn remembered the date precisely because he had had a difficult day, a project at work that had come apart at the seams, hours of rework, A late bus home in rain that turned the city into a blur of headlights and wet asphalt. He had arrived home after 10, eaten leftovers alone, and come to his room in the state that difficult days produce. Wrung out and hollow, the particular tiredness that is not just physical. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when he heard the knock. 3 quiet taps, distinct and deliberate, not the kind of knock that happens by accident. He sat up. "Come in." The door opened. Daniel stood in the frame, wearing a plain white kurta, his hair slightly disheveled. He had clearly been asleep and woken up. He was holding a glass of water in one hand, as if he had picked it up on the way and then forgotten it was there. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Come in," Zayn said again, reaching over to turn on the small lamp on his nightstand. Daniel came in and sat on the edge of the bed, Zayn's bed, which he had never done before. He set the glass of water on the nightstand. He sat looking at his hands. Zayn watched his brother and felt the particular alertness he had learned to recognize. The sense that something real was about to happen, that the air had changed, that the next few minutes would matter in ways that could not be predicted. "I've been awake for 2 hours," Daniel said. "I keep thinking about something and I can't stop." "What?" Daniel looked up. In the lamplight his face was very clear, every line of it, the dark curve of his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw, the expression of someone who has thought something through completely and is afraid of it and is going to say it anyway. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to know that whatever your answer is, it won't change what we have. I don't want you to feel any pressure. I don't want you to feel like you have to be anything other than what you are. I just—" He stopped, exhaled. "I have to ask, or it will sit in me forever and I'll never stop wondering." Zayn's heart was beating in a way that was different from ordinary. Slower and heavier, each beat more present than usual. "Okay," he said. "Have you ever thought about living honestly?" Daniel said. "Not privately honest, not just with me, not just with Sami, but actually fully out in the world. Not hiding, not performing, just being who you are, out loud." The question landed differently than Zayn had expected. He had been prepared for something smaller, something more personal. But this was something else, larger and more important. This was the question at the center of everything. The question that lived in every one of those nights of lying awake, every practiced smile, every deflected question from his mother about when he was going to get married. "Yes," he said carefully, "I think about it." "What does it feel like when you think about it?" Zayn considered this for a long moment. "It feels like standing at the edge of something very high," he said, "and not knowing if there's anything to catch you if you jump. But also, somewhere underneath the fear, it feels like the only true direction." Daniel was watching him with great attention. "The only true direction," he repeated softly. "Yes." "Bye," Daniel said. His voice was very quiet now. "What is stopping you?" And Zayn opened his mouth to give the answer he always gave: the family, the world, the complications, the impossibility of it, and found to his own surprise that the words would not come. Not because they weren't true, but because sitting in this lamplight room with his brother watching him with clear eyes and an honest face, the old answers suddenly felt like exactly what they were: armor, deflection. The practiced language of a man who has been afraid for a long time and has gotten very good at making the fear sound like wisdom. "I don't know," he said instead, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said, "Can I ask you one more thing?" "Yes." "Is there someone? Has there ever been? Is there anyone you think about? Anyone who means something to you that way?" The lamplight was warm and steady. The city outside was quiet. It was past midnight now, that particular late hour when even Lahore slows to a murmur. The ceiling fan turned. The house breathed around them. "There was someone," Zayn said. "A few years ago, a colleague. He left the firm. It was never spoken about, but I think we both knew." What was his name? Saad. Do you still think about him? A pause, sometimes less now. He looked at his brother. Why? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very careful and very gentle, because I think you deserve to think about someone who is present, someone who is here, someone who can actually think about you back. He paused. I think you deserve an actual life not a performance, not a hiding, a real, actual life. The room was very still. Zayn looked at his brother, this 19-year-old boy who had come to his room in the middle of the night, with a glass of water he had forgotten, who had sat on the edge of his bed and asked him the most important questions of his life, who was watching him now with an expression of such clear and uncomplicated love that it was almost difficult to look at directly. He felt something in his chest give way. Not break, give way. The way ground gives way not when it collapses, but when it softens, when the season changes and the frozen earth slowly remembers how to open. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He was not going to cry. He was an adult. He did not cry. He cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, involuntary release, the kind of crying that happens when something has been held for too long and the body simply makes a decision. His shoulders shook once, twice. Daniel did not say anything. He did not offer hollow comfort or easy words. He simply put his hand on Zayn's shoulder and kept it there, solid and warm and present, while his older brother, the responsible one, the careful one, the one who had spent 23 years learning to disappear, finally, quietly came apart. They sat there for a long time. When Zayn had collected himself, embarrassed, quieter, lighter in some fundamental way he could not explain, he looked at his brother and said, I don't know what to do with all of this. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, Daniel said simply. I know, but eventually. Eventually, yes, but not tonight. His brother paused. Tonight you just know that you're not alone. Can that be enough for tonight? Zayn looked at him. When did you get this wise? I've always been this wise, Daniel said. You just weren't paying attention. It was such a perfectly Daniel thing to say, delivered in that dry, matter-of-fact tone that diffused any solemnity, that Zayn laughed. An actual, unguarded laugh startled out of him, and the sound of it felt strange in his own chest, like a room that has been closed for a long time suddenly being opened and aired. Stay, Zayn said. It surprised him even as he said it. I mean, if you can't sleep anyway, stay and talk to me about anything, just talk. Daniel looked at him for a moment, and then he kicked off his slippers and settled back against the headboard, and they talked until the sky outside the window shifted from black to blue-gray to the first pale suggestion of dawn. They talked about everything and nothing, about a film they both loved, about a memory from childhood that they discovered they had remembered differently, about a bakery near their father's old office that sold almond cookies in a particular way that neither of them had been able to find again. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped pretending, when the performance is over and what is left is simply two human beings in a room, known to each other, willing to stay. At some point, Zayn became aware that his brother had grown quiet. He glanced over and found Daniel asleep, head tipped back against the headboard, the glass of water still on the nightstand, morning light beginning to press through the curtains. He looked at his little brother's sleeping face for a long moment. He thought about what Daniel had said, an actual life, not a performance, not a hiding, a real actual life. He thought about Saad, about the way they had stood once at the window of the firm's third floor, watching the city below, and Saad had said something funny and Zayn had turned to respond and found him already watching, already smiling, and the moment had simply existed between them, unnamed and unacted upon, until the office around them continued its noise and they both looked away. He thought about the future, which was still large and complicated and full of questions, but it seemed, this morning, perhaps a fraction less like a wall and more like a road. Long and uncertain, yes, but going somewhere. He turned off the lamp. He lay down carefully so as not to wake his brother. He looked at the ceiling, the old familiar ceiling of a room he had grown up in, with its small water stain in the corner and the slight crack above the window, and for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man trying to disappear. He felt like a man who had been found. A year is a long time when you are learning how to live honestly. Daniel went back to university in September, but something had changed in the architecture of their relationship. They spoke on the phone every few days, properly, not the brief obligatory calls of before, but real conversations that sometimes ran past midnight, that covered everything from the serious to the ridiculous. Daniel sent voice notes when he was walking across campus. Zayn sent photographs of buildings he thought Daniel would want to draw. They were finally brothers. For Zayn, the year was full of small, incremental brave things. He did not make any grand announcements. He did not change his life overnight. But he began, slowly and deliberately, to stop performing in the small ways, to deflect his mother's marriage questions less elaborately, to allow himself to simply be present in his own life without spending all his energy on management and concealment. He started seeing a therapist. This was Sami's suggestion, gentle, patient Sami, who had known him since they were 17 and who received the news about Daniel with an expression of quiet, relieved happiness, as if a long-awaited thing had finally arrived. The therapist was a quiet woman with a large houseplant on her windowsill and the ability to ask questions that required actual answers. For the first 6 sessions, Zayn spent most of the hour being carefully not quite honest. By the 7th, something gave way. By the 10th, he was talking in a room with a stranger in a way he had never talked in a room with anyone. He was, very slowly, learning how to exist in his own life. In December, at the firm's end-of-year gathering, a colleague introduced him to a friend. The friend's name was Omar. He was an urban planner, quiet, thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor and the kind of attentiveness that made you feel, when he looked at you, that he was actually listening to what you said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. They talked at the gathering for an hour and a half, without quite noticing the time pass. Zayn went home afterward and sat in his room and thought about the conversation with a feeling he recognized, but had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. A warmth, a specific kind of interest that was not merely intellectual. He called Daniel. "There's someone," he said, before Daniel could say hello. There was a pause. Then Daniel said in a voice rich with restrained delight, "Tell me everything. It's nothing yet, it might be nothing. Tell me everything anyway." And Zayn sat on the edge of his bed, the same bed where, 4 months earlier, his brother had sat in the lamplight and asked him questions that changed the direction of his life. And he talked about Omar for 40 minutes, and Daniel listened to every word, and the house around him was quiet and warm, and outside the window the city moved in its slow December rhythm, and the ceiling fan clicked its old familiar beat above him. He was 24 years old. He had a brother who knew him. He had a therapist who challenged him. He had a friend who had stood by him since he was 17. He had a man's phone number in his pocket who had laughed at his joke about parabolic arches and meant it. He had, perhaps for the first time, a life that was facing the right direction. Daniel came home for winter break in the 3rd week of December. He arrived with the same 2 duffel bags and a new sketchbook, number 18, he announced, with an air of achievement, and their mother made his favorite food and their father asked about his grades, and the house settled back into its rhythms with the ease of long practice. On his second night home, Daniel knocked on Zayn's door. "Come in," said Zayn. His brother came in, sat on the edge of the bed in the old familiar way, and opened the new sketchbook to a page near the middle. He held it out. Zayn took it. It was a drawing of 2 figures on a rooftop. The city spread out below them, suggested in loose, confident lines, the impression of lights and rooftops and the general generous sprawl of the city at night. The two figures were sitting on a sheet, facing the view, their shoulders almost touching. One was slightly taller, more contained. The other was looser, more relaxed. Between them, in the negative space where they almost touched, Daniel had drawn nothing at all, and somehow that nothing communicated everything. At the bottom of the page, in Daniel's cramped handwriting, were 4 words: "The summer we started." Zayn looked at the drawing for a long time. He thought about that rooftop, the heat of July sitting on their shoulders, the city humming below them, his brother asking, "Do you ever feel like there's a version of yourself you can't show anyone?" And himself, answering with a deflection, a practiced coward sidestep, not yet ready for the key that had just been placed before him. He thought about everything that had happened since, the knocked doors and lamplit conversations, the night he had cried in his own room while his brother kept a hand on his shoulder and the morning came slowly through the curtains, the therapist with the large houseplant, Sami, steady and patient, Omar's number in his pocket and the warmth of thinking about it. He thought about what he was still someone navigating, still someone with a long road ahead and no certainty about what was at the end of it, still, in the quiet of his own room at night, sometimes afraid, but also known, witnessed, accompanied. "This is beautiful," he said. "It's yours," said Daniel. Zayn looked up. His brother was watching him with that expression, the careful hope, the open face, that he had first noticed at the beginning of the summer and that had not changed. If anything, it was clearer now, more sure of itself. "Thank you," Zayn said. And he meant it in all the ways the words could carry, for the drawing, for the rooftop question, for the night in August, for the phone calls and the voice notes, for the hand on his shoulder, for being 19 years old and braver than his older brother and never once making him feel lesser for it. Daniel seemed to understand this. He nodded, in the way he had of receiving big things without turning them ceremonial. "So," he said, settling back against the headboard in the old familiar posture, "tell me about Omar." Zayn laughed. "There's nothing to tell yet." "There's clearly something to tell, or you wouldn't have called me at midnight in December." It was 11:45. "That's midnight." Zayn looked at his brother, his impossible, wonderful, perceptive, entirely aggravating little brother, and shook his head. "He suggested we get coffee this week," Zayn said. Daniel's face split into a grin, wide and bright and completely unguarded, the Daniel grin, the one that never failed to be contagious. "Okay," he said, "now tell me everything." And Zayn, sitting in the warm lamplight of his own room, with the drawing of 2 figures on a rooftop resting open in his lap and the city quiet outside, and his brother's grin filling the room with more light than the lamp, began to speak. "There is a kind of love that does not ask anything of you except that you be honest. Not romantic love, though that comes too, in its own time, in its own way, to those who are patient enough and brave enough to walk toward it. This other kind, the kind that arrives in the form of a brother who knocks on your door in the middle of the night and sits on the edge of your bed and asks you the questions you have spent your whole life afraid of being asked. This is the love that comes before everything else. The love that says, 'I see you,' not the performance, not the careful, managed, glass-walking version of you, the actual you, the frightened, real, beautiful, broken, trying person underneath all of it. I see that person and I am not going anywhere." Zayn Raza was 23 years old when his little brother gave him that love, and it did not fix everything. It did not resolve the complications or answer the hard questions or make the road shorter or the world more generous. He was still, the morning after the lamplight conversation, the same person he had been the morning before, still afraid, still uncertain, still navigating. But he was no longer navigating alone. And that, it turns out, is the difference between a man who survives his life and a man who begins, slowly and imperfectly and with great effort, to actually live it. The coffee with Omar went well. Well enough that they met again the following week, and the week after that walks along the canal on weekday evenings, quiet conversations about cities and design, and the strange specific loneliness of caring about beautiful things in an indifferent world. It was slow. It was careful. It was, both of them seemed to understand without having to say so, a thing that needed to be treated gently. But it was real, it was present, it was facing forward. In March, Daniel started a new sketchbook. On the first page, he drew a single door slightly ajar, light pressing through the gap. He texted a photograph of it to Zayn. Zayn looked at it for a long time. Then he texted back, "That's exactly what it feels like." Daniel replied with nothing but a single small sun drawn in the corner of the photograph in yellow marker. Quick, imprecise, unmistakable. This is what love actually is, in the end. Not grand gestures, not lightning bolt moments, not the kind of love that resolves everything neatly in the final chapter. Love is the knock on the door at midnight. Love is the hand that stays on your shoulder while you fall apart. Love is the drawing of two figures on a rooftop, almost touching, the city spread out below them, everything still possible. Love is someone who knows the version of you that has to hide and chooses to stay.
Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Prism Heart Chronicles. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos.